We are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning, Larry Johnson. Larry Johnson has been a journalist for more than 30 years, most recently as the national and foreign editor at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper. His award-winning writing has appeared in numerous magazines and newspapers, and he has traveled to more than 35 countries, covering Iraq for the PI in 1999, 2002, and 2003. A collection of his work, Looking for Trouble, Dispatches from the Middle East, Asia, and Central and South America, was published in 2008. Start out, tell us, how did you end up being a journalist?
Well, I think I really became interested in becoming a journalist when I was in Vietnam as a soldier. And I was trying to figure out what the hell I was doing there. And it seemed like after being in the country for about a year that I really wasn't doing what I thought I was going to be doing, is saving the United States for democracy and fighting communism throughout the world. So I was trying to figure out what was going on, and decided that maybe what I should do is become a journalist if I survived the war. I always knew I wanted to be a writer, but and then finally I decided I'd concentrate on journalism.
So did you go to school for that?
Eventually, after I got home, got out of the Army, I went to school, and I actually studied history and majored in Asian history because of my interest in Vietnam and the China, which was supporting Vietnam at the time. Studied the language and graduated with a history degree, and then became a freelancer. And
you were the national and foreign editor at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer for how long?
Well, I was there for about 11 years until they closed. Paper went out of business in 2009, March 2009, and it was a great job. It was the best job ever in my career. I was able to pick my own stories and develop the projects and go overseas, and the paper sent me to about a dozen countries while I was there. It was really a great job.
So how did you land that? That does sound like a really nice position.
Well, it was a nice position. It started out as mostly a wire editor, just taking wire from our various sources, Associated Press, New York Times, and helping the editors decide where they go in the paper. And then based on my freelance background, I was able to convince them to send me to Iraq in late 1998. And we did a big piece that was very popular and got a lot of attention for the paper on the sanctions that were killing thousands and thousands of people in Iraq. And so based on that experience, then I became more of an occasional correspondent for the paper, going overseas once or twice a year after that.
So talk more about that, since I want to talk about Iraq a bit. What was your original interest and motivation in wanting to do that story?
Well, some people came to me, a local activist, Bert Sachs, and he said I should do a story as the foreign editor at the time. I was the foreign editor for the PI, and he said, this is a really good story. There are a lot of people dying in Iraq, and it's not being covered. Are you interested in doing a story about it? And I said, well, yeah, I'd really like to do a story, but I don't want to do a story from here. I want to go there and do a story so I can see it for myself and experience what's happening. And there was a group of doctors being led by another local activist named Jerry Haynes, who was going to Iraq to witness themselves what was happening in the hospitals with the children and mostly elderly people who were dying by the thousands at the time. Eventually, probably over the 10, 12 years of the sanctions, killed over 1 million people. So I met Jerry Haynes and agreed to go with her to Iraq, and then convinced our editors at the PI that this would be a good story.
And did you know of the impacts of the sanctions prior to going over to see this?
I did not. I have heard that the sanctions were really draconian, that this was the first time we'd really used these economic sanctions against civilians. They claimed they were targeting the elite, Saddam Hussein and his folks. But I had already heard that they were really affecting the people. But I really didn't appreciate how severe they were and how badly the people were suffering under these sanctions until I went there.
So I have to imagine you had covered a lot of, you'd been to numerous foreign countries prior to that.
I had. Yeah, I'd been to the Philippines a couple of times. I'd been to South America, and so I'd seen a lot of conflict. So yeah, I had traveled quite a bit and reported on what I'd seen.
And that particular series of articles did garner a lot of national attention as well?
It did. What happened is I came back, and I had a really great photographer with me, Dan DeLong. He's one of the greatest photographers around, I think. I worked with him a few times. He came back, and with his photos and my stories, we put together an 8-page newspaper-size page special section that was published, and then I think some of the local activists, Jerry Haynes and Bert Sachs and others, distributed the section to every legislator in the country, every senator, every representative, and then it won a national award. And so it was very popular. It became the most reprinted section in the history of the newspaper. So we got a lot of attention for that, and based on that, I was able to convince the editors to send me to a lot of other countries.
So you returned to Iraq 2 more times. In 2002, what was the motivation in going then?
Well, we knew that at the time President Bush was pushing for a war against Iraq. And my motivation, a personal motivation, was to go there and present the human side of Iraq. Just individual people, what they're doing, how they're feeling about what they felt was the coming war, and to try to get people to understand that this wasn't just against Saddam Hussein, it was against the people of Iraq. And so we went there and spent about 3 weeks with another photographer and did daily stories, did some blogging, and then came back.
And then 2003, had the war begun when you went over?
2003, Bush had just declared victory on the deck of the carrier, and I went back in with Dan DeLong again. And, of course, we saw that there was no victory and that the people were suffering worse than they had been under the sanctions. The electrical grid was completely wiped out. Sewage was running raw in the streets. People were suffering from malnutrition, lack of all kinds of health care. We had pretty much devastated the country.
So now we fast forward to the present time, summer of 2010, and the White House has just declared that we've pulled our last combat battalion out of Iraq and that basically we're sitting on victory here. What isn't the corporate media covering now about that story?
Well, I'm not sure. I think, you can still find, excuse me, stories, even the corporate media, but it's on the back pages, or it's a sidebar to the main story. The main story was the troops pulling out, and they made a lot out of that. The problem is they really haven't pulled out. We have 50,000 troops that, if you ask the Pentagon, yeah, we have them. They're going to be there indefinitely. There's no timetable, I don't believe, for them to be completely out of the country. And we have all these bases there, very high-tech, expensive, billions of dollars spent on these bases, Air Force and Army. And I don't believe we're going to give those up anytime soon. And the country that we've left behind after our great victory in pulling out our troops, allegedly, is still in shambles. The government is barely functioning. Medical facilities are still not very good. The people are still poor. Unemployment is rampant. The country, we bombed it, back to the Stone Ages, basically, and it hasn't rebuilt. And we've offered no real tangible rebuilding of the country. The money we spent there has disappeared to a large extent, and we have nothing to show for it, or very little. And
then happening, obviously, at the same time, we've got the U.S. increasing its troops and weapons and money in Afghanistan. You just actually had written a segment in your blog entitled Media Blitz aimed at preventing troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. Can you talk about that?
Well, General Petraeus was going on about how the big withdrawal from Iraq gave us more opportunity to beef up forces in Afghanistan. And he was kind of setting the stage for keeping our troops in Afghanistan for an indefinite period. The president wants to get out within a year or two. And the generals, I think the Pentagon, would like to see us stay there the way that we have stayed and are going to stay in Iraq. So he was setting the stage with a media blitz, mostly with the big media, Washington Post, New York Times, and doing some of the CBS, ABC interviews, saying that there was a real need, if we wanted to prop up the government and keep a, quote, democratic government in Afghanistan, we have to keep our troops there. So that was basically what I was writing about. And, you know, it's just another example of how this country is taking a wrong turn in another area where we've sent troops and invaded a country. Instead of sending troops, we should be sending massive amounts of aid. We should launch something like we did after World War II, the Marshall Plan, in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And that's the kind of thing that would really help the people. It would also help this country. It would change the image of this country to someone who's actually helping people instead of just invading their country and getting what we can out of it.
The most recent Petraeus media campaign, is that something that you saw regularly when you were at the National and Foreign Desk at the PI? Is that like a tour that they would try and entice writers at the PI to participate in?
Well, there were always emails. Yeah, sure, and trying to get journalists to participate in those kinds of interviews. For us, of course, being on the West Coast, usually by phone or something like that. And it's something, you know, you normally don't turn down. But the difference, you know, I would, if I was working as a journalist today and Petraeus came, or one of his spokespeople, public information officer said, "Would you like an interview with General Petraeus?" I'd say, sure. But I wouldn't just let him come on and talk and say whatever he wanted to say. I would ask him questions about why we're staying in Afghanistan and why we don't give more aid, and you know why are we still bombing civilians despite all the harm it's done to the Afghan people and to the United States. But unfortunately, there are still a lot of media outlets who give him the opportunity to come on and without the hard questions.
One of the things that seems actually unique to the position that you had was that you got to travel to so many countries and then, you know, spend time there and then come back and report. Do you see that as the current permanent trend that, you know, the reporting via Google Maps is how reporters will do it in the future?
Unfortunately, I think that's true. I think there will be two ways of reporting in the future because of the new media. The big change is that the established media won't be sending journalists overseas. It's just too expensive. And what a lot of other media will rely on are poorly paid, very inexperienced journalists who are young and willing to go somewhere overseas and act as freelancers or stringers and send back reports. So it's going to be a little bit patchy, the kind of journalism we get in the future, I believe.
The other thing that one seems to notice a lot on, at least I notice on watching the television coverage, which I realize you're in the print media, but is the reliance on these corporate parent company reporters that are based wherever, and that all the independent I use that loosely, local television stations go to that person and they put their logo on it and say, you know, oh, this is our reporter in D.C.
Exactly. Yeah, there's the centralization of the news media, and that's a real danger for democracy. You when we had more newspapers, more TV stations, the more journalists you have out there, experienced journalists doing good work, the better, because you get a wide variety of opinions.
But when you talk about the cost itself of flying someone wherever and reporting for X period amount of time, that hasn't really gone up. I mean, it has,
It hasn't gone up, but what's happened is in just about every medium available, radio, television, print, advertising has gone down. And I'm sure you know that people just aren't supporting the news media like they did in the past. It used to be a big deal for every television stations to have correspondents everywhere. And it used to be a big deal for every major newspaper to have correspondents, national correspondents and foreign correspondents. I saw a trend from the time I started working at the PI in '98. We had national correspondents, we had a foreign correspondent, we had 2 foreign correspondents at the time. Within a year or two, we got rid of the foreign correspondents. I basically became the foreign correspondent, going only once or twice a year out somewhere, which is kind of a ridiculous situation in itself for a major metro newspaper. And then by the time we shut down in 2009, we had no national correspondents, no foreign correspondents, and I was doing both the national wire and the foreign wire. So we'd really regrouped and cut back everywhere we could. And we're a major metropolitan newspaper focusing on the city of Seattle.
So I guess the flip side of that is with the internet becoming more prevalent in every country on the planet, people being able to produce their own pieces via YouTube, let's say, or whatever, and getting that to reporters like yourself. Do you see that as a valid way of getting news out?
I do see that as a valid way of getting news out, especially when news is breaking in a country. For example, back during the elections in Iran, a lot of good things were coming out of there just by tweets. So those things are good, but you still need a lot of good, experienced journalists to sort out all that mass of information out there. And you still need a gatekeeper. I hate to see it because people resist that word. They don't want a gatekeeper. They want full democracy, which means everybody is their own journalist. And I really don't believe in that concept because I think you still need someone experienced to sort out what's good from the bad.
All right. Another place that you had gone to recently was Syria or Gaza. Can you talk about that?
I went to Syria. That was in 2007. I went there because it was, again, kind of following up on the Iraq War. And there were something like 2.5 million Iraqi refugees living in Syria and living in really pretty bad conditions. So I went there to cover that and see what the Syrian government was doing, trying to see what our response was, and see what international humanitarian groups were doing. And at the time, the Syrian government pretty much was doing everything they could. Syria is a pretty poor country, but almost nothing was being done from the United States, by the United States, and very little by international NGOs. At the time, Mercy Corps was just making some inroads and getting permission to come into the country. And it became the first to start helping Iraqi refugees in Syria. So I spent about 2 weeks traveling all through Syria because the refugees scattered around the different major cities and visited just about every major city in Syria. And there were refugees everywhere living in poor neighborhoods, unable to work because the Syrian, there's a high unemployment rate there already, so legally they couldn't even work in the country. So they had whatever money they brought with them from Iraq, that's what they lived on. The hospitals weren't able to handle all the people, schools weren't able to handle the children. It was a really bad situation.
And that's a serious number of people. We're talking, that's like 10% of the Iraqi population.
That's right. And that's just in Syria. There's another 2 to 2.5 million people scattered in Jordan, Egypt, and elsewhere in the Middle East. Refugees, Iraqi refugees. So a total of about 5 million Iraqi refugees out of the country. And we finally, at the time, the United States wasn't accepting very many Iraqi refugees at all. But under pressure, a lot of international pressure, they finally, the following year in 2008, started accepting a few more. But I really mean a few, 100 or 200, at a time. And so maybe they would take in 700 a year. Those are ridiculous numbers when you have 5 million Iraqi refugees.
And 3 years later now, it's 2010, are the number of refugees still relatively the same?
The number of refugees in Syria, and completely out of Iraq, still is around 5 million. And I know from talking Syrian contacts recently that there's still 2.5 million there. The conditions have improved a little bit, but not much. They're still not able to work. A lot of the children are in school. Most of the children are in school. They can get medical attention. The United Nations is working very hard to help them, but with not enough support from international community, especially the United States, is still not stepped up.
I'm curious, you haven't actually specifically written about this in your blog yet, but the floods in Pakistan appear, from what I've seen, to be absolutely devastating. What about that coverage would you do differently if you were still at the PI?
Well, I think the focus still, has been, and I've seen some good coverage on the Pakistani floods. What some of the local bloggers and activists have been doing is continuously running some of the Pakistan-based non-governmental organizations who are working on the ground, helping the people immediately because they're from the area. They can help them better. And so they've been publishing in blogs list of local aid groups that can respond immediately. The others, the bigger ones, the internationally known like Mercy Corps and others, it takes a little bit longer to get up and running. But I know Mercy Corps and some of those other groups are getting in there now. So I think I would just focus on that because it's an ongoing problem. It didn't just happen and it's going to be cured overnight or in a week or two. It's kind of like the earthquake in Haiti, but it actually affects more people. And it should be that kind of a focus. And we really haven't given it that kind of focus that Haiti got, and it should be.
Do you have any insights into both the corporate media as well as just the American public's consciousness about major incidents? For instance, we're looking at the 5-year anniversary of Katrina, which has completely fallen off people's radar with the exception that it's the 5-year anniversary. We just, you mentioned Haiti, that's not on the radar anymore. The Gulf oil spill apparently isn't being mentioned much. I mean, now it's like the egg recall. That's, top story.
Right.
So what's your thoughts on why that doesn't stay on people's, front of people's minds?
Well, I think that's been an ongoing problem that the news media, they want to change their story as fast as they can, because that's what brings people back. People in this country especially, more so than in a lot of European countries, they have a short attention span. And these big things, they get worn out by seeing the same story, same type of story over and over again. For example, Haiti. And again, I think part of the problem is because there aren't a wider number of journalists out there covering it, a bigger number of news media organizations reporting on it, which would give you a different perspective. Instead, you get the same perspective over and over again, and people just burn out. I think the news media, the corporate news media, is responding to actual viewers, readers, who are burning out on the whatever issue it is. And so they move on to the next as quickly as they can so they can get all those people coming back to their website or coming back to their newspapers.
And how much pressure did you receive? I mean, you told us before that you pretty much had relatively free reign on what you were covering, but at the PI, was there pressure to cover certain issues and or drop certain issues at a certain point?
No, I'd never, in fact, in my entire career, I've never experienced that kind of pressure where I had to cover something because it was more politically palatable. I've been very lucky, and I think, the mainstream press in general doesn't really respond to those pressures. Where you get the pressure is from individual reporters with the mainstream press who have a certain political agenda. And that goes along maybe with the owners of the paper or the owners of the broadcast media, whatever it is. I've never felt that kind of top-down direction of what we should write about.
So you currently you have your book. You have a blog, which is at LarryJohnsonOnline.com. Are you part of the Post Globe team?
I am. A lot of journalists from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, right after the paper shut down in 2009, we all got together and we created this website, seattlepostglobe.org, and it's local news, a lot of people who used to work at the PI, and now we're starting to incorporate other journalists from wherever we can find them. We're all working for free. It's a volunteer effort. We have been working for about a year and a half, making no money. We do pay some of our freelancers occasionally. We do pay some of our photographers occasionally, but it's pretty rare. So that's what we've been doing and looking for work. And most of the journalists there's 150 of us at the PI, most of the journalists are still out of work a year and a half later.
The former PI still survives online in a very photo-oriented format. Kind of you can see the latest Hollywood star of the day photos if you go there.
It does. I mean, there are still some good people working there, former colleagues, but I don't think what they're doing is something I would want to be part of. It gets something like 4 million hits a month, but like you said, it is focused. They do some local reporting, but its focus is on using wire services and photos of celebrities.
We're speaking with Larry Johnson. He is the former national and foreign editor at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and author of the book Looking for Trouble, Dispatches from the Middle East, Asia, and Central and South America. And I have to ask you real quick, there's a photo on the cover of your book. Can you tell us about that?
Well, that was taken many years ago. I was in the southern Philippines. One of the first national stories I published wound up in Mother Jones magazine. This was with the Moro National Liberation Army. They were fighting in the southern islands against the Marcos government at the time, the Marcos dictatorship.
And you were telling me before we went live that you weren't sure whether you were going to be walking away from that particular experience alive.
Well, one of the guerrillas who led me into the jungle, I spent about 3 weeks with him in there. He told me when we came back out that they had debated whether just to kill me or to go ahead and let me interview their leaders. And luckily, they decided to let me interview the leaders and get me out of the country.
Which allows you to be here today. So with that, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.